Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share an update on my experience with the Sony A7R Mark IV. Now, this is the latest addition to Sony's full-frame mirrorless interchangeable lens camera lineup, $3,500 US. That is an increase in price from the previous generation, the A7R Mark III, but Sony has gradually done this with pretty much all of their cameras as they have become more successful, and that's because their pricing was always lower than the competition. So it makes sense. What has changed? I covered some of this in my unboxing, I covered some of this in my preview, but now I actually have the device in my hands. So, first and foremost, ergonomics. The camera is beefed up. Dimensions are very similar, the weight is a little bit heavier, mostly in the grip, but also in the body. This bump out just doesn't exist on the A7R Mark III. Beyond that, I would say the most important thing, of course, is the brand new sensor, a 61 megapixel sensor. We've got a deeper buffer to deal with. We have a completely different door design here on the SD card slots. And instead of a UHS 1 and 2 slot, we have two UHS 2 slots, which is smart. Now, some people are complaining that they should have future-proofed this more. Quite frankly, I think that two UHS 2 slots is sufficient, but I understand that complaint. In terms of buttons on the back of the camera, things have changed, but not that much. A lot of people are talking about, oh, the buttons are completely redesigned. If you take a look at the previous generation, A7R Mark III, you will quickly see, and by the way, the reason I have this, the 28-135 FE lens here is because it's just an example of how large some of the glass is that you need to support. Of course, that's not a lens for everybody, but I happen to like that lens a lot for its versatility. And that extra grip, whether you have big hands or small hands, is going to come in handy. It's going to make things easier to deal with. But again, getting really close on the back, you can see the differences. So yes, some buttons have been changed. The joystick specifically has been changed. Buttons have been made bigger, the press, the actual travel of the keys a little bit different, but that's really not the difference in these cameras. Of course, it's the sensor, again, 61 megapixels with the A7R IV, a little over 42 with the A7R III, and then the autofocus system. I mean, that's what it's really all about. And this is not a comparison, but I just brought it in so you could see. I'll save the comparison for another day. Now, with regard to that autofocus system, eye autofocus we already had with the A7R III. We did not have real-time tracking for video, and that is a big feature here. However, I don't know, or I don't really think the majority of people who will be after this for still shooting because of that bump up in megapixel count, which really makes it a formidable competitor to medium format, are going to care at all about that capability. Because after all, that's specifically targeted at video. And while the A7R has always been a great hybrid offering for still and video, and that's what I think this maintains, I don't know that anyone who's out to purchase this specifically to get the bump, the boost in the megapixel count realm for studio work, landscape work, whatever it may be, is going to care that much. I mean, they'll welcome the fact that real-time tracking is there for video, but I think they may not care that much. But that bump up in megapixel count is definitely a welcome thing because it changes what the A7R is capable of in this fourth generation. Now, beyond that, we did get an improved EVF, which so far, from what I'm seeing, is nice. I mean, the dot count is higher. There's no other way of putting it. Refresh rate is the same. 120 frames per second is where it maxes out. But every time Sony launches a new, full frame body like this, they generally do try to improve those sorts of things. So I'm not surprised that we got a higher dot count here with the OLED EVF. Battery life, roughly the same as the A7R Mark III, so that's still solid. The port array, pretty much the same, but the big difference here being that the Type-C connectivity is not 3.1 but 3.2. So a lot more bandwidth there than you have on the A7R Mark III, and that is a noteworthy improvement. But what I have been complaining about for years and now has finally been addressed by Sony is Wi-Fi performance. And I can happily report that the chipset on here is in another class. Another class so much so that you can wirelessly tether, which is a really big deal. Not just for me personally, I think for many of you out there. And that's because while, of course, you could have always done a wired tether, the connectivity was never there to actually do anything wirelessly. Now you can do it. Mic and headphone jack here, HDMI out. Of course, we are not dealing with 4K 60. I wish we had it. We don't. Your flash sync right there. Weather sealing is supposed to be improved. Do I expect it to be impermeable? Absolutely not. So while Sony every generation talks about improving the build quality, how rugged the camera is, and you can tell, I mean, this is arguably the beefiest of all, full frame models from Sony ever. I'm sure, I'm not going to test it. I can tell you that right now. I'm not going to. But overall, I like the feel. I wasn't sure that I was going to like the extra grip, but I do. And that's why I brought out this monster, is because when you're shooting with something like this, you're going to tend, if you're hand holding, which I tend to do, you're going to use, the lens to actually balance it out. But now with a grip like this, I feel like I can split the weight a little bit more evenly than I could. And I don't have gigantic hands by any means. So, those of you that do are going to absolutely want this. Now, will it warrant spending the additional money? No. I mean, not if you don't actually care about the improvements that I've mentioned so far. One thing that I will point out, right off the top is that people who are looking for a different experience when it comes to, the actual menu system, unfortunately, you're not getting that. I mean, I'll bring it up nice and close right now. You're not getting a new menu system. You're getting new features all around, and the touchscreen performance is supposedly improved, but as you can see, you're not getting touchscreen in the menus. And I think that is something that Sony needs to do, even though they're looking at this as a pro-grade camera and they think most pros don't want to use their fingers to switch settings. I think it's also them trying to ensure that things won't accidentally change. And I understand that, but with that in mind, I still think there's a reason to give us that capability at this point, especially for $3,500. I just think it's kind of a no-brainer. But just taking you quickly through, of course, you're going to want to shoot in RAW and JPEG, but bear in mind, you better have SD cards to handle that, because these new 61 megapixel images in RAW 14-bit are monsters. In terms of theoretical improvement or actual information, I think it's like a 68% gain or something. I forget what the actual number is, but over the A7R III. So that's a lot if you're going to shoot in RAW. And then if you're going to piggyback it with a JPEG, which I recommend because you don't always need RAW. It's good to always have it, but it's definitely always good to have a JPEG copy. Then you're going to be investing some nice money in those UHS-2 cards. And none of them are going to actually achieve their theoretical write speeds, but make sure to buy good ones. I may do another video on that just so that people know where to look for quality brands and also effective pricing for said quality. Beyond that, everything else here is kind of the same. Aspect ratio, we have new options. I mentioned this in my unboxing. I mentioned this, I'm pretty sure, in my preview. We did not have a one-to-one aspect ratio, and I don't believe we, these are just added niceties that didn't need to be there, but it's good that we've got them. Otherwise, just a quick run through. We have new color science, which has been, part of Sony's whole new push, which has been well received, and I like what I see. I mean, we're talking about JPEG straight out of camera. They look good. The interval function has been brought back, so you can do a time lapse. Of course, there's no Play Memories App Store here. There hasn't been for quite some time since the A7R II, which I still own, and I still think is a great camera. For the right price, I'd probably part ways with it at this point. But everything else here, nothing is really new. It's all about the autofocus competency. That the fact that we've moved from 399 phase point to 576 phase points is a big deal. But as I mentioned in my unboxing, what's kind of unique about that is that even though we've got this major bump, because we went up to 61 megapixels, there's still only about 7 or 8% difference in terms of covering their respective sensor. So that's an interesting trade-off that has to be made. Other things to note, we still are at 10 frames per second. So, that hasn't changed from the A7R Mark III, but the buffer has. So the deeper buffer makes a difference because as long as you have an SD card that can keep up with your shooting, you can just go on and on to your heart's content. But just running through the menus here quickly, I'll do something deeper and more, detail oriented on my full review. But you can see here, of course, your video format settings, which will all be predicated on your file format. You want 4K, you're going to go to 4K. This is nothing new. I mean, would I have liked to have seen them bump this up beyond the 30p 100? Yeah, I would have. Everyone would have. But that's still the highest quality, the most amount of information you're going to get. In terms of the higher frame rate shooting, 120 frames per second is still where you're going to want to keep it. I really don't think you want to exceed that. I wish they would have changed the way this is implemented, but I'm not going to get into that until we get to the real review. Furthermore, one thing I haven't mentioned is their new shotgun mic. I'm not sure that Sony, I don't think I have that lined up to be shipped to me, but I'm going to try to get it because it does promise to be, the first digital audio shotgun mic designed specifically for Sony cameras and a whole new level of performance. So a lot hinged on that in terms of if it actually does perform really well. If you need a vertical grip for this, Sony does sell it. It's about, I think, $400 US, and it does exactly what you would think. Gives you a vertical grip, extra battery life, and continues the fit and finish and design cues as it should. Beyond that, let's get over to networking so you can see that. So inside networking, you still have the basic send to smartphone and all of that, but it's a matter of, the FTP right there, transfer function. That's where we're getting into being able to actually communicate and tether wirelessly. And that's a big deal. I mean, that is part of getting an improved Wi-Fi chipset, which I've asked Sony to do for years. I just never understood why we kept getting new models where they improved the photographic tool, but weren't improving something so basic. And now they have. It's kind of like the Type-C port. I mean, we were missing Type-C. Finally, it came around. Now they're even bumping up the Type-C capability. So they're aware of what they need to do, but because they're in the driver's seat now, things have changed. I mean, it gives them flexibility they simply didn't have before. But everything else on here is pretty much the same. The only other things that I would point out, in terms of the body style, again, very similar. In my experience so far, battery life seems to be very similar. That hasn't changed too much. It's really all about the higher megapixel count, which again, I think if you're a studio photographer, landscape photographer, you're going to welcome that. Do you need the 61 over the 42? You probably don't, but I don't know anyone who's ever going to say no to it unless it compromises the fidelity of what you're capturing. And because we still have, the same dynamic range, the same ISO as the A7R Mark III, but at 61 megapixels, that's kind of amazing. And I really didn't give that a whole lot of credit in my preview, but I should have because that is important. I mean, those are things that should take a hit if you're bumping up the megapixel count. And that's where this is a new sensor. It's not just a sensor they've added megapixels to. They had to implement new engineering in order to make this possible. The button improvements, the EVF improvements, those are minor things to me. I mean, the EVF is critical, don't get me wrong, but the EVF on the A7R Mark III was already great. Only one camera on the market, was able to best it. So Sony's now in the same position it was previously. But beyond that, this is really all about that 61 megapixel sensor. It's all about the real-time tracking with the autofocus system and the overall improvement autofocus that you get both with the eye detection with humans and the tracking there, and with animals. Even though we're animals, I mean pets. Cats and dogs are, pretty much what Sony is talking about. Can it do more? I'm sure. I haven't taken this thing to the zoo, and where I live, birds are just about the only other thing. And I've seen it lock on with birds, but it's hit or miss. But again, the most interesting thing to me about this is that, one, we have now the highest megapixel count of any full-frame camera. Before this, it was the Canon 5DSR, which I think is a little over 50 megapixels. And, now to have, 60, I think, again, I said earlier, it's like 68% of the amount present here with the A7R III is just nuts. The dynamic range, I already emphasized, and the ISO staying the same. I mean, that the 15 stops is a big deal, considering this new sensor has so much more information. And as I mentioned earlier, be wary, aware, not wary, of how big these files are going to be. I don't recommend cards that are really under a half terabyte. I mean, I know 256 is the sweet spot on cost, but considering where you may end up in terms of running out of space, I think it's good to have two 512s on a beast like this. Now, one thing I haven't spoken about is pixel shift. I haven't played with that really, but I'll talk about it for a minute. And it existed with the A7R Mark III, so it's not a new thing, but they improved it. And so essentially what we're talking about here is that the sensor on this bad boy, instead of taking, I think with the A7R Mark II, it was a low number. It was like 4 consecutive images, and it would shift 1 pixel between each frame. Here, on the other hand, they've really taken that to another level, and it's going from 4 to 16 captures, and it moves by a half a pixel in between each shot, giving you up to a 240 megapixel still. I mean, it still requires desktop software and all that jazz, but that is bonkers. I mean, that is just craziness. And when you combine that with the autofocus prowess, and I haven't mentioned that if you throw in an APS-C lens, which I have plenty of from my APS-C E-mount cameras, you then get a 26 megapixel experience, but basically 100% coverage of the entire sensor, at least the APS crop, which is a really nice thing. I think it's technically 99, whoop-de-doo. But that's still really impressive, because that means that the autofocus should just be perfecto. And that is something I think all photographers will welcome. Granted, you're not necessarily always going to be shooting in a crop mode, but let's say I want to throw my 10 to 18 mil E-mount wide angle on there just because of how compact it is. I'm not going to be upset getting 26 megapixels with perfect autofocus, or nearly perfect, since nothing is really perfect in life, right? That's a great thing. So something to consider. And for me, the video is a big deal, the real-time tracking in video. Will it be enough for me? I don't know. But, the fact that in the crop mode, you're able to cram, I think it's over 60 frames at 10 frames per second it's crazy. I mean, that's again, it's another bonkers thing. Whereas in the A7R, it was like 18 megapixels instead of the 26. So these are all important things. Are they game changers? That really depends on what you plan on doing with the camera. No different than the viewfinder. I mean, going from, it's the same field of view, or magnification, I should say, same half-inch OLED panel being used, but the fact that now we're at, I think it's 5.7 million dots, that's a big deal. That is, I think it's only on the Panasonic S1R. So they've made sure to cover all of their bases, that this product is going to not only be unique to Sony, but to everyone else, because that's been Sony's thing. It's to beat out the competition. It's to undercut them and produce a better overall product. And it seems like, by all measures, they've done that with this. And 3,500 sounds like a lot, but when you look at the competition, it's right in line. It really is. Again, the buttons I don't think are a big deal. The redesign of the joystick, I wasn't unhappy with the A7R III joystick. Is this one better? Yeah, it's a little more tactile. And the build quality, same for me. I mean, like, I could have lived with the same exact form factor as the A7R III. Do I think this is smart? Yes, because now you're accommodating users that found the A7R III too small. Do I like that it's gotten larger? No, not really, because the beauty of Sony's mirrorless business has always been the best still and video capability in the smallest form factor. And now we're getting larger and getting more comparable to, Canon, Nikon, the rest. I mean, I'll throw Panasonic in there also. But those are the critical differences between this, the A7R III, and much of the competition. It's really that this thing does take on medium format, but at a full frame price, at a full frame body size, with full frame lenses. And I'm sure Sony's going to roll out even more glass. Again, the predominant use I've been going through so far is with this, but anyone who follows my channel knows that I have a lot of full frame glass. I mean, not so much G Master. The only G Master I use regularly is the 100 to 400, but in terms of the regular G series and Zeiss lenses, I have a pretty good lineup. The 16 to 35 f4, that's kind of my favorite outside of this lens. I have some primes, so I mean, I'm testing them all, but this kind of lives on my A7R III, and I'm trying to see how it lives on my A7R IV, and so far I'm happy. I mean, again, the color science, the detail in the images, I've always welcomed more megapixels. I'm not into the race. I'm not into a war of megapixel count, because that can be useless, but I've always loved having more megapixels because I love being able to find the image within the image, and this camera right now is the king of that. So if you're out to find a great image that you may not have gotten because you didn't have enough technical information, this camera will accomplish it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Yeah, it's got NFC like all the other cameras that Sony's ever made in the last 5 years. But again, hope you enjoyed the update. It's longer than I planned on, but this is a pretty important product for Sony. It's a pretty big launch. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.